Hi everyone, this is a review of our beginning string lessons this week, and this lesson was all about pages 10 and 11 in the lesson book, which introduces 3 new notes. So for everyone except basses, you're learning 3 new notes on the A string. Basses, you're learning 3 new notes on the G string. So if you take a look at the yellow box on the top of page 10, you'll see that the 3 new notes for everybody are B, C sharp, and D. And you might be thinking that you already know a note called D, and you do. You have your open D string. But the D we're learning today is an octave higher, or 8 notes higher than your open D string. So often I will call that note high D. So when you hear me say high D, I'm talking about the new note D that we're learning today. Open D is the open string that we learned previously. So the nice thing about this for violins, violas, and cellos is that playing B, C sharp, and D on the A string feels and looks identical to playing E, F sharp, and G on the D string. So you're putting down either 1, 2, and 3 fingers, or 1, 3, and 4 fingers, depending on what instrument you play. And you should be able to see that pretty clearly in the yellow box. Bass, things are a little bit different for you. This is actually slightly more challenging than anything that the other instruments have to do, but it's something that you have to learn as a bass player. So everyone else, you can actually skip ahead. But basses, you have to do something called third position. So other than that first note, B, which is 4 fingers on the G string, you're going to have to take your hand and move it down to make a higher pitch. And both of these notes are marked on your instrument. So you have your 4 fingers for that note B. You're going to move your hand up and put your second finger on the marked note for C sharp, and then your pinky, your 4th finger, on the marked note for high D. And when you do that, it's called being in third position. So bass players have it a little bit different. Everyone else, it is the same exact concept as playing on the D string. So I'm actually going to skip numbers 23 and 24 because those are just practicing playing the notes, and you can do that on your own. But let's take a look at 25. So you can see 25 has 2 different notes, high D and C sharp. And it's called take off because after you play those high Ds, to get to the C sharp, you're going to have to take off a finger. So remember, high D for violin, viola is 3 fingers. High D for bass is 4 fingers. And then high D for cello is 4 fingers, and then high D for bass is 4 fingers, but in third position. So go ahead and put those fingers down for high D. Okay, and we're going to play 25. 1, 2, here we go. Rest. Rest. That's some good practice, not only reading the new notes, but practicing moving in between them quickly. So now if you take a look, 26 and 27 are similar in that they have the same 3 notes, just in different orders. So 26 and 27 both have high D, that new note that we just learned, and C sharp, but they also have your open D. And you'll see that in both of these tunes, there is a little bracket underneath connecting. Normally it's a high D with another high D, and then there's some low Ds in between. That bracket is there to remind you of a very important concept that is actually going to help you and make things a little bit easier for you. So for all of the instruments, when you're playing high D, your fingers are on the A, or if you're a bass, G string. And when you go over to play open D, you don't need to take your fingers off from the high D. So here's my high D, and here's my open D. Because it's on a different string, you don't need to take your fingers off. Now, why does that matter? Because if you took your fingers off every time you needed to play open D, then you would have to reset them as you're playing. So if you look at 26, we played high D, C sharp, high D, open D, and then after the rest, you're back to a high D. If you don't take those fingers off, you're saving yourself the time of having to put them back down. Because I know a lot of us are still working on that hand frame, working on knowing where your fingers go. And so it's going to save you a lot of time and just make it sound better. And this is even a technique that professionals will use. So this is not something for beginners or to make it easier. Well, it is to make it easier, but it's not something because you're beginners. This is a technique that even professionals will use. And so when you see that bracket, it's a reminder to keep your fingers down. Now it's important when you keep your fingers down that you're on your fingertips so your fingers are not touching the D string. If your fingers are touching the D string, that will prevent it from vibrating and making the correct pitch. So make sure you're only on the string with the high D, you're not touching the open D string. So that being said, I am just going to play number 26 and I'll leave number 27 for you to do on your own. So here's 26, and if you'd like to, before you play it along with me, you can watch and see how I don't take my 3 fingers off at all from my high D. So here's 26, and there is a repeat, but I'm just going to play it once. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. The other thing that is tricky about that, and that it's a good thing to practice, is going back and forth between 2 strings. So now your bow is having to move, and we talked about this when we first started using the bow, that as you change strings, your arm actually kind of moves and your elbow goes up with you. If you're a violin or a viola, you kind of raise your arm to get to that lower string. It's a little bit of a different motion for cellos and basses, but it's really good to practice switching strings like that and make sure that you can be comfortable doing that. We're going to move ahead a little bit. I'm going to skip 28 as well. 28 has that note B in it. And I'm actually going to skip for right now 29 and 30. Those are things that after we do the next thing that we're about to look at, you'll be able to go back and do 29 and 30 very easily. But if you look at that yellow box in the middle of page 11, there's a new word there, and that word is scale. And what we're about to learn is a very important thing that we're actually going to be doing basically from now until you stop playing your instrument, and that's playing scales. So there is a fancy definition of scale in the yellow box, but I'm going to give you my definition that I think is easier at this point in your playing to remember. So a scale is a pattern of notes that starts and ends on the same pitch. So right now we're doing the D major scale, so it's going to start on your open D and end on your high D. And in that pattern, you're going to play every single note in between those 2 notes. So you're going to play D, then the next note, E, then F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, high D. So you're going to either keep going up or going down. The yellow box talks about ascending, that is a fancy word that means going up, or descending, that's a fancy word that means going down. And so it's kind of like you're walking up the stairs playing from one D to the next, but you're playing every single note in between that you could possibly play. Now, in my opinion, the book actually kind of did this backwards. I think I'd like to look at 32 first and then 31. I understand why they did it this way, but we're going to look at it back in the opposite order. So if you can take a look at 32, this is the ascending, the going up scale. And you can see that we play each note 3 times. We start on open D. We play every single note that we've learned on the D string. Then we go over violin, viola, cello to open A and play every single note that we know on the A string. Bass, again, you're going to the G string and playing every note you know there. So I'm going to go through 32. There's a rest in between the 3 of each note. That gives you a chance to set your fingers down, think about where you're going next. And here's number 32. This is your ascending going up D major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, high D. Awesome. So that's going up the D major scale. Now, in the future when we play a scale, we're actually just going to go up and down and not stop in between. But this is new. They have them written as 2 different exercises, so I'm okay with stopping in between. The other thing is, you might have noticed that pattern is very easy to memorize. It's a pretty simple pattern, so something I'm going to encourage all the students to do is learn how to play that by memory. And I can guarantee that in the next 2 weeks we're going to be doing it so much in lessons that they probably will memorize it over the next 2 weeks. So now here's 31. This is down the D major scale. This is the descending version. So we're starting on high D. Set those 3 or 4 fingers down depending on what instrument you play. Get ready to play high D, and now we're going backwards. I will tell you the part that tends to get most students, that's a little bit tough, is when you go over to the D string and all of a sudden have to put all of your fingers down. That's kind of a big move to have to do that. So you might have to practice doing that a couple times to get it down fast enough. So I'm setting my fingers down for high D. Here's number 31. 1, 2, here we go. C sharp, B, here's A, G, F sharp, E, D. Alright, so that's everything on pages 10 and 11. Make sure you really have those new notes down, know how to read them, and where to put your fingers down, how to play them. And then also really start working on that D major scale. We're going to spend some more time working on that in our next lesson. So keep working hard. We'll see you in your next lesson.